Les pedimos el favor de apagar sus teléfonos celulares. Le recordamos al público asistente que está prohibido consumir alimentos y bebidas en el auditorio. Gracias.
Good morning. On behalf of Dr. Rector of the University of Los Andes and the Director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Development Studies, Dr. Oscar Pardo, I would like to offer you a very friendly welcome to the Rising Bogotá Forum, The Anatomy of Peace. First of all, I would like to thank the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations, Center for Democracy and Peace Building, and Coventry University, and especially to Eva Grossman and Fabi Drogo for making possible this event. It's a great honor for us to be part of the important discussions we will have this morning. I also want to especially thank all our distinguished guests, also then Professor Matt Woodruff and Lord Allardyce. With them like this, we want to reaffirm the enormous commitment of Los Andes University with peace construction. We are very interested in promoting a broad dialogue between the entire academic community, and we are very committed to the construction of knowledge in the face of the enormous challenges of peace building in Colombia. We believe that the role of the academy in the framework of the important process that our country is going through is to foster debate and critical construction. In the Interdisciplinary Center of Development Studies, we want to contribute in particular to the reflections and collective construction of development alternatives in this transition context in order to move towards a sustainable peace. We are also committed to the promotion of a culture of peace and coexistence in the country, starting for our students and our entire academic community. We are confident that the discussions we will have today will make an enormous contribution to this goal. The main table is composed by Professor Al Osserden, Professor of Peace Building and Co-Director of Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations. He had nearly 20 years field research experience in the politics of humanitarian interventions, conflict prevention, disaster response, security sector reform, reintegration of former combatants, and post-conflict state building. His expertise spans some of the most unstable regions across the world. Lord Allardyce, in the last 30 years, Lord Allardyce has been involved in almost every aspect of the Irish peace process. He also established the Center for Democracy and Peace Building in Belfast to work on the cultural and attitudinal changes that will complete the Irish peace process. From 2000 until 2009, he was Deputy President and then President of Liberal International, and now a lifetime President to honor of this institution. The Lord Allardyce's work has been recognized with many national and international awards. Professor Matt Woodruff, Director of Research and Professor of Political Science at the University of Coventry. He studied at Bresson's College, Oxford University in UK. The BBC has defined him as one of the world's leading referendum experts. His book includes, among others, a comparative study of referendums and ethnic conflict, and referendums around the world. He has worked as an expert for the State Department of the United States. And Eva Grossman, co-founder and CEO of Belfast-based Center for Democracy and Peace Building, committed to completing the peace process, changing attitudes, building a normal society, and sharing Northern Ireland experience internationally. As a head of programs at the Northern Ireland Assembly Legislative Strengthening Trust, Eva developed and implemented Politic Plus, a capacity building program designed to enhance the skills and effectiveness of those involved in political and public life also initiate Polish Cultural Week and Polish Film Festival in Northern Ireland. But now, Dr. Eva Grossman, you have now the floor. Thank you all for your assistance. Thank you very much. So last week I was listening to BBC Radio to this arts program, and there was an interview with this amazing artist from India who was carving beautiful wooden elephants. And the BBC reporter asked him, how do you do it? How do you achieve such a beautiful work? And the artist was almost surprised and astonished by the question. He said, well, I just take a piece of wood and I carve everything out what is not an elephant. So in the last 35 years, 117 peace processes have been analyzed, including here in Colombia, including Northern Ireland. And what we often fail to do is to find the simplicity in the complexity. Papers upon papers are being produced, analysis, but sometimes the actual core problems are not at all being recognized, and the key stakeholders are not being reached out to. However, we've got few amazing professors here who will help us to find the simplicity in the complexity today. However, yesterday, after a series of meetings, very diverse meetings, when I went to bed, I thought about something else. I thought about Lockhart principle, a principle which is used by police forces all across the world. A principle which says that every contact leaves a trace. Every contact leaves a trace. And in today's world, full of uncertainty, of liquid fear, it is really, really important how we treat each other and the traces which we leave. So I have no doubt that our three amazing professors will leave very positive traces here today in Bogotá and will inspire you and energize you to continue your work in peace building. So I shall pass you on to Matt, who will take you on this little adventure.
This poster is one that was used in the 1945 general election, and I don't want it to be a party political broadcast, so sorry if those of you who may not have voted for the Labour Party in Britain, but the reason for using this poster was that it's one thing to win a war, it is quite a different thing to win the peace. And I think the problem for a lot of countries is that they have often, and I will name no countries in particular, invaded countries, and then they expected that peace will sort of come almost automatically. And one of the times when that had happened after the Second World War, Albert Einstein was once asked, why, Professor Einstein, is there no world peace? And Albert Einstein then answered, that is because political science is infinitely more difficult than physical science, which I think is, in a way, sort of my starting point to what I was starting talking about here. I've already messed it up, I think, with the PowerPoint presentation. And I'll actually go back to this one just as a starting point. Now, in a way, the way I got interested in peace, I've been involved in, marginally, not in the way that my distinguished colleagues have, but sort of as a backroom boy in a number of everything that's going on. I don't understand what it's probably going on. Okay. Anyway, we're going too fast. Some years ago, I was asked, what does it actually mean? I've been studying electoral systems, I've been studying parliamentary systems, I've been studying all the things that political scientists are interested in. And somebody asked me, it happened to be my brother, he says, well, it's all interesting with all your electoral system and parliamentary system and referendums and all that, but what does it actually matter? I can see the interest in politics, but I don't actually see why it actually matters. And I then sort of came up with the suggestion, at that time it was no more than that the more you include people in a society, the less likely they are to blow things up. His response to that was that you don't really need a PhD to be able to say that. My brother is a rocket scientist, actually, so there's a bit of that, a bit of rivalry going on there. However, I pursued this line of research for a while and sort of came up with a model that's been used by some political scientists, mainly back in the 60s, which is known as the input-output model of politics. And the idea is very much here that outside the political system are the people who like or want to make decisions, make our laws and implement them and so on. But out in the real world, there are people who have grievances, people who have concerns, and then they raise those concerns to the politicians, to political parties. They then get into the political system, at least in a healthy political system, and then they get out on the other side. So if you're not happy with the tax system, then you raise your concerns, it gets into the political system, and it gets out in the other way, and then hopefully you're content with it. And that is true for pretty much every political issue that you deal with. Now, the problem for some political systems is that there are certain groups that are excluded from that particular process. For example, in Uruguay, to take a Latin American example, for many, many years there were two parties, Blancos and Colorados, and they basically monopolized politics, and then those people who had different views could not get into the political system. And as a result of the third force in politics not being able to get into the political system, if you can't get into the political system legitimately, well then you blow the door up into the system, and that basically is terrorism. So from a sort of sociological point of view, there's a reason why certain institutions are there, and that reason is that those political institutions allow people who are outside the political system to raise their concerns. And in the absence of these particular political institutions, you then get terrorism. Now, in some ways, that's a very sort of abstract model, and whenever I proposed this particular model, people say, well, at a very abstract level, I'm sure that is right. So most of the research I do, which is around statistical models, my colleague will know that I'm probably one of the few people in my department who does statistics. I feel slightly bullied because of that, I'm saying yes. Anyway, I use statistical modeling, and one of the things that people, and I will explain this shortly, it's not as mysterious as it looks. One of the things that people always said to me when I started to work on terrorism, when journalists ring me up, then they would say, well, people just do terrorism because they're poor, or people do terrorism because it's angry young men. There is in political science, there's a thing called the James Dean theory of terrorism or political violence, which comes from the angry rebel without a cause. And the argument has been around that if you have many young men between 18 and 24, well then you're more likely to get a lot of stuff blown up. Also, another argument that's been advanced is that if a lot of people live in cities, then people in cities are more likely to get grievances, they're not poor and so on, and there's also more likely to lead to terrorism. And then yet another one here is that if you have many people, so large countries just basically have terrorism. And then the last one, I suppose the most sort of famous argument in political sociology has been the Human Development Index, or Human Development argument. If you basically live in a poor country, then you're more likely to have grievances, and that can result in terrorism. Now, my argument basically was not the sociological argument. There is obviously a place for sociological explanations, but I think those sociological explanations can be came up with what we call an index of inclusive democracy. So an inclusive democracy is one where you have many political parties, but it's also one where the different political parties work together. So here in Colombia, at the moment at least, it's a coalition of parties working together. It's not just one party. So if you have one party in power, as you have in some countries, then that party is likely to exclude the others, and then people feel alienated from the political system. So one of the things we looked at in the data we looked at was, when are you most likely to have terrorist attacks? Of course, that's the problem with that. As a social scientist, remember, this is much more difficult than physical science, according to Albert Einstein. But so, what do you define as a terrorist attack? And in the way that we operationalize it, we say, when we have a terrorist attack, if people are killed by a particular group, not just the so-called lone wolf. So if you have one man who just goes on the rampage, like in Norway, that doesn't constitute organized terrorism. But if you have situations where a group of people, like the IRA previously in Northern Ireland, or FARC in this country, are organized and use violence as a political means, and that they actually kill people, then you basically get a tick in the box of having a terrorist group. So those places that have fatal, where people are willing to kill for their beliefs, are considered to have a terrorist problem. I then ran through the various calculations, and I don't want to turn this into a lecture in theoretical statistics, because that's probably boring enough as it is. But when you run so-called logistic regression models, it's basically you want to have a very high number and you want that to be statistically significant. So in theoretical statistics, to make a long story incredibly short, the figure has to be as large as possible, and then the figure underneath in the brackets has to be less than half of the top figure. Yes, I can explain later, but I don't want to go into detail about that. And what is interesting about this particular piece of research was that if we look at human development index, like whether people are rich or poor, that actually is not theoretically or statistically that important. Also, a large youth population is not that important. In other research, and I have a paper I can hand around to you, I looked at immigration, whether you have many immigrants, is that likely to lead to lots of terrorist attacks? In fact, there is no statistical correlation between immigrants and terrorist attacks. Just in brackets on that particular one, in Britain we have a newspaper called the Daily Mail. And the Daily Mail had apparently understood that I had written a paper where I said that there was a statistical correlation between terrorism and immigrants. So they rang me up and said they wanted to write a piece. And I said, well, I'm happy to write a piece, but who ghostwrite it for you? I said, are you sure you've actually read my piece? And I said, yes, we read your piece, which shows that there's a correlation between immigrants and terrorism. And I said, well, my piece actually shows the opposite. There is no correlation. So the little word no is quite important here. And for some reason, then they weren't interested in my op-ed. There you go, basically. So what is interesting about this model, and what I think is in some ways brings hope, is that if it was only sociological factors, if it's a large youth population, or if it's a large urban population, or those are things that you can do very little about. I mean, it's difficult to change the composition of the population. But the fact that you actually can have a more inclusive democracy, that you actually can design institutions that are conducive to building peace, of course, that is only a correlation, and what happens afterward, how you use those institutions to actually include people. But the fact that you're actually able to do something about peace, that you can actually, in a way, engineer the conditions under which peace is more likely to succeed, I think that is a very positive thing, and I think it is a small contribution to the very difficult science that is called political science.
Good morning, everybody. Buenos dias. It's great to be here. And in the time allocated for me, I will be focusing on a very particular aspect of peace building. And that is the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of ex-combatants. So since the end of the Cold War, so many societies across the world went through this DDR process. And as you will see from the title of my presentation, having looked at many places how DDR programs have been implemented, I decided that perhaps I should share the lessons of how not to do it, rather than telling you what we should do. And largely because the international community and national authorities that implemented DDR programs, I think we made so many mistakes in many places. And in the name of reintegration, probably we ended up with ex-combatants who really ended up in poverty, not real sense of reintegration, and potentially ready for being re-recruited as combatants. So that's what I will try to do with you. And in my research, I focus on ordinary people, ex-combatants themselves. And hence, I want to start with a few examples of those people who we call combatants who went through these formal DDR programs. And I will bring in some examples from different parts of the world. So what you see here is a group of young Afghan men who were DDR'd, kind of like as the terminology goes. They went through a formal reintegration program implemented by the international community. And they were in northern Afghanistan when I took this picture. And but out of these 5 young men there, 2 of them are still fighting, despite of the fact that they already went through a DDR program. In fact, even today in Afghanistan, it takes only $2 to employ a combatant per day. And if you have a few $1,000s, you can have your own private army. So that is a reality that we need to recognize. This whole idea of post-conflict is actually in the minds of the international community often in terms of a kind of a process. But in reality, conflict continues in many parts of the world, even after a ceasefire or peace accord or a peace deal. So those young men, they were still engaging in fighting in different ways, and largely because of the economic difficulties that they were facing as ex-combatants. And that's the reality that we really need to bear in mind. In many places we say, well, you are not DDR'd, you are reintegrated, but the fact that they joined the army of unemployed, the difficulties of poverty in their own contexts. And when it comes to ex-combatants, we need to recognize that there are so many differences, whether they are old, young, whether or not men or women, their class, their background. And in many places, for example, we have quite a high percentage of female combatants involved in these armed conflicts. And armed conflicts actually really change socio-cultural dynamics in many societies. Women tend to have a much stronger voice in such armed groups. They can have really sort of high rankings in those groups. But once that fighting comes to an end, we tend to expect those women to go back to their more traditional roles, becoming a mother and the wife, and that's itself a huge problem. But more than that, when you think about it, there's a very strong social stigma for many female combatants across the world. Because in the African conflicts particularly, their role is not always fighting. They are used as concubines, they are used as sex slaves, they experience terrible gender-based sexual violence. Therefore, it's not always easy to say, well, yes, I used to fight during the war. They in fact hide. And when it comes to DDR, they try to just integrate into society, self-demobilize themselves. They don't even have that identity. Those 3 young men, I'm not ageist, there are 3 combatants, former combatants in El Salvador. And I want to point out another very interesting phenomenon with ex-combatants. We tend to look at the case load as a kind of one unity, But the fact that those three men went through the same DDR program but benefited from the process in a completely different way. One of them was a file and rank ordinary guerrilla during the war, and he was given a plot of land as part of the reintegration deal. But the soil conditions were just so bad that, in fact, he couldn't really tend his field, he didn't really get anything significant in terms of income. And when I interviewed him, the last 10, 12 years, it was a life of poverty for him. And he was really angry at the political leadership of the MNLF because he felt that he was really kind of betrayed. Another man over there, he used to be a university teacher, and he used to work in civil society. And his trajectory of reintegration was completely different. He was running one of the largest national NGOs in El Salvador at the time. And another one over there is a politician. His trajectory again was quite different, and his understanding of reintegration wasn't too bad. He reintegrated into mainstream politics and his income and everything. And in fact, at the time when I asked, well, could I interview some leadership of those guerrilla groups, they said, well, actually you are in the wrong place. Now most of them are in Oxford because as part of the reintegration program, they were given scholarships at Oxford University and they settled there. So, you know what I mean? There are so many different pathways with the reintegration and what they get out of it. And my last point with the differences between ex-combatants, and that's the factor of age, child soldiers. And in African conflicts particularly, a very high percentage of these young people trying to reintegrate in their society. And this whole idea of going back home in the reintegration process may not really be an option for them. And it's really over-romanticization because they don't have families, they don't have communities to go back to. Even if they have, it might be the case that they won't be wanted by their communities. In West Africa, for example, those young kids were forced to commit atrocities against their own families to cut the relationship between them and their communities so that they won't be able to go back home. So this is what the reintegration means for some of these young people. Therefore, we really need to have a very good understanding of what we are talking about here when it comes to reintegration. And in formal DDR programs, in the name of some sort of training program or some sort of income generation program, we assume that those people are reintegrated in society. But the reality is that they end up in really difficult living conditions. Now I'm going to use my excellent graphic skills and I'm going to sort of abstract way explain what's happening. So when you look at the sort of transition from war to peace, we have those three stages. And the international community often treat those stages: disarmament, that means taking the weapons from people, from combatants, demobilization, and sometimes we keep them in transitional camps before sending them home, demobilization, and then reintegration. But the issue here is that we often assume that this is a linear process, and often they should take place one after another, and often different types of actors involved. So disarmament tends to be the responsibility of military in many places, and then when it comes to reintegration, we see the civilian actors taking a much more active role. But I think one of the main mistakes we make with DDR is that we try to come up with this magical formula. Please don't take it down. That's sort of like, we are sort of trying to represent the fact that there is no formula like this. And the reality with that is a hugely political process. And we don't really recognize the sort of the politics of that. Politics both in terms of capital P, that's the sort of political party issues, and small p, that is the power relations. Because at the end of the day, you are talking about weapons, combatants. So, and I think in many places, this tends to be one of the starting points with our sort of problem in understanding of the real phenomenon. So, let me just summarize some of the points that I learned from other places in terms of what we shouldn't do in DDR. The first one, I think, is really crazy to think that there's an automatic correlation between DDR and improved security. And let me argue in this way. Collecting weapons from armed groups, yes, symbolically it is really, really important. But in many places that I studied, ex-combatants, guerrilla groups, militia, they really give up only the very small percentage of their weapons. It's often the tip of the iceberg. So assuming that just because we undertook a disarmament phase, then there will be no weapons left in that particular context, I'm afraid we are kidding ourselves. We need to assume, we need to really just bear that in mind. The second issue is that I think the demilitarization of mind is much more important than disarmament. Because if people want to fight, if people want to kill, rearmament is really not that difficult. Especially with the porous borders, with the black market, with the sort of the exploitation of natural resources, so on and so forth. It's not that difficult for those groups to remobilize and to rearm themselves. So let's not put so much emphasis on disarmament. We really need to think about sort of the long-term reintegration and the issues of positive peace. The second point that I want to make is that the socio-economic value of weapons. In many places, especially in African conflicts, this was the case, by weapon, combatants look after themselves, their families, their communities. It's almost like a tool for income generation in a very crude way. So if you take that weapon, what are you replacing with? I think that's really the question we need to ask. And also socially, in some societies, carrying a weapon is very strongly linked with masculinity. They don't want to give up their weapons. They feel demasculinized because of that. So those issues are hugely significant to bear in mind. So with my examples earlier, I mentioned that they are not all male, they are not all fight, and they take really different roles, combatants in fighting, and they are not all adults. So we really need to bear in mind those differences and go for tailor-made reintegration programs for specific needs of those groups. And I think this over-romanticization of home, we really need to avoid that. For many combatants, there is no home to go back to. They really need to rebuild a life from scratch in many places, especially if they engage in an armed group, say for 10, 15, 20 years, or perhaps all their childhood, their normative upbringing took place in such an environment. It's really a big assumption that there will be this open armed people waiting for these combatants when they go back home, especially in conflicts when there is not a single victor, especially when they go back to their communities almost like as a minority. The other point I think we need to bear in mind is that in the name of economic reintegration, the programs that we run, they don't really bring prosperity, jobs, employment. We really need to bear in mind this wider framework of that particular environment, what's happening there. And so I come across many vocational training programs, for example. We put combatants in a room like this, 3 to 6 months, we pay them stipend so that they attend those programs. And they learn carpentry, or they learn how to be an electrician in a classroom without having any opportunity of really sort of applying those skills. And at the end of 6 months, we say, well done, here's your toolkit, now you are a carpenter, go and work. That is just really, it's good to tick that box, to say, oh, we reintegrated 30,000 ex-combatants. But in reality, you just pushed 30,000 young men, women, into unemployed army of that society. And also the other point we just need to bear in mind that, and more and more I see this as an issue, we put far too much emphasis on economic reintegration and forget about social reintegration. And we don't really deal with the issues of what happens between combatants and with their families and their immediate communities. we assume that those communities, they always want them back, and also they will have resources to help them in their reintegration. But in reality, these assumptions are wrong, and they are really dangerous. So, in my thinking, when we think about reintegration, it should be all about really a social contract. So in terms of, okay, we are taking those weapons, we are demobilizing, so we are taking those social structures around these people. What are they going to be replaced with? So, and we shouldn't be surprised in many places, there's an increase in the level of criminality, for example, in post-conflict environments. Violence transforms into different means. Well, in San Salvador, the homicide rate is one of the highest in post-conflict environment. So, and there are really strong reasons with what hasn't happened with reintegration there. And we need to think about reintegration first. I think disarmament is so mediated. People are really interested in kind of decommissioning weapons. You have a media interest, and so the politicians want to show that, look, symbolically, we've done it, we sorted out the issue of combatants. But really, the key focus should be what's going to happen with this combatants in their reintegration. And when I talk about reintegration, I'm not talking about the formal kind of period of that reintegration assistance. What's going to happen the next 5-10 years? That process is long-term and it's very challenging. And I think we need to change our attitude towards ex-combatants. This is really, again, to do with, around with this social contract. If we continue seeing them as a security risk, if we don't build good sense of trust between ourselves and those ex-combatants, I'm afraid those processes tend to fail. Because if they are not able to find a voice, a place in society, the only option they end up with is joining in criminality, in sort of gangs and the other activities. So we need to be very careful about that. When it comes to economic reintegration, I know something about the DDR process here in Colombia, and I think it's a really important point. Training people, educating people, we really need to understand that supply-demand relationship. I came across, in Afghanistan or Kosovo, we trained so many carpenters, so many electricians, and they had no jobs. We didn't really calculate the fact that, there would be no job employment opportunities for them. And vulnerability based on gender, age, disability, ethnicity, they continue. They don't come to an end after the implementation of the DDR program. We need to bear in mind, for example, psychosocial aspects with certain vulnerable groups in our case laws. And the last 2 points that I want to make is about really treating receiving communities as part of DDR programs. And I think in Colombia, one of the most significant questions that should be asked, okay, we are dealing with these ex-combatants, with FARC combatants, but what are we going to do with the receiving communities? Are we really thinking about the issues that they are going to face because of this reintegration? Around security, around economics, around using natural resources, changing socio-cultural dynamics. That perspective will really, that should force us adopting a social reintegration focused approach. And perhaps that will really require us to change the orthodoxy in our mind about DDR and ex-combatants and trying to take a fresh take on those issues. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed for the invitation to come back to the University of Los Andes. It's very good to be back here with friends like Fabio and of course Miguel here. And we're trying to look at the anatomy or the elements of peace. Actually, I'm not going to look so much at anatomy as psychology. because my own approach to trying to understand issues of conflict has been to try to understand why individual people get into these kinds of difficulties, and then to apply those understandings to whole communities of people, who I don't see as simply a collection of individuals, but rather as a group. We all know that what we can achieve as individuals is one thing, but what we can achieve as a team of people is something quite different. You could have 11 very good footballers playing for Colombia, and they would keep losing the match if they didn't play as a team. If every one of them wanted to be an individual star and nobody ever passed the ball to anybody else, it wouldn't work. So we know that there are not just those systems that make up our individual bodies and individual selves, but beyond that there are systems that bring us together in families, in communities, and indeed in a global community. And my interest has been to try to understand why that kind of cooperation, why that working together breaks down into violence and conflict, and sometimes into quite intractable conflicts that go on not for years and for decades, but for generations and even for hundreds of years. Why is it that we don't find a way of engaging together? You might think that this is a rather strange, woolly kind of way of looking at things. Psychology doesn't always get a very good name. And yet, it has a very good credibility. There was a mention earlier on by one of my colleagues of Albert Einstein. And at the end of the First World War, the nations came together, they formed the League of Nations, and they began to think, how can we use human abilities to make sure we don't have another war, another terrible war? And so the Secretary General of the League of Nations wrote to a number of very bright, capable people and said, please try to engage with others who you regard as really serious intellectual contributors, and let's try to understand this problem better. And so he wrote to Albert Einstein, great physicist, extraordinarily clever intellectual, wonderful scientist, and he said, please correspond with the one person who you think can help us to understand this better. And so he wrote a letter to Sigmund Freud to say, why do we keep breaking down into war? And Freud wrote back to him a rather interesting letter about the kinds of reasons that we keep breaking down into violence and war, and what we can do about it. But one of the problems about the way that we have looked at things over a long period of time is that we are tempted to try to find an answer to some of these problems in a linear fashion. Why did this happen? It happened because of this. Or more often, when we try to find a solution, we want a quick solution, we want a clear solution, and we say, what would sort this problem out? Don't confuse me with a whole lot of details. Just tell me what would sort this out. What's the key thing? What's the thing that makes the difference? And then we find, of course, that that doesn't work, because the reality of life is more complicated than that. So we say, it's not just one thing. It's maybe two things. Maybe it takes not just A to get us to B, but A plus B plus C to get us to D. So we add in a few more caveats, and more academics like us write papers and say, well, it's not just this, you need that as well, and perhaps a little bit of the other. And then that doesn't quite explain it either, and it doesn't quite solve it either. And if you're really enthusiastic, then what you do is you go around the world and you find every possible way, every possible skill, every known protocol for producing a peace process, and you put it all in a big bag and you say, we're going to do all of them. And in many ways, as an outside observer, I would say that's what you've tried in Colombia. You've worked really hard at it. After many decades of violence, which often was not understood or recognized outside of Colombia. I mean, for many people outside of Colombia, if you say there's trouble, they would say, yeah, there's drugs. There was no idea that there was any deeper history or background to it than that. And most people are quite astonished when those of us who are interested in Colombia tell them how many victims there are, how many people were involved, what length of time it's gone on for. People are quite astonished. But you have had on more than one occasion, and now you currently have, a president who says, we've got to sort this. This is a real problem. And so what President Santos and his colleagues have done is that they have gone around the world, including coming to places like Northern Ireland, to say, what were all the things you did? Not what was the one thing, or the two, or the three things, what was all the things that you did? And we note them all down, and we'll try to do all of them, because we really, really want to get an outcome. But the difficulty is this doesn't always work either. Because some of these things are actually counterproductive to each other. And some of them need to be done in a particular order if they're going to be successful. You can start doing something and it's not the right order. Every teacher knows that you can't start teaching children complicated things before you teach them simple things. You teach the simple things and that builds up. And then you may even have to tell them, you know those simple things we told you, well, they're not actually very true. I mentioned Einstein and physics, and you know, whenever we're younger, we learn that material world is made up of bits, of parts, of atoms, we call them. And their atoms are indivisible particles. That's the stuff of life. Then as you get a little bit older, you discover that actually there are subatomic particles. What we told you wasn't quite true. Atoms aren't indivisible, there are subatomic particles. And then after a while you begin to discover, well, actually the subatomic particles aren't actually particles. They're force fields, and they're kind of balls of electronic fuzz, really. But of course, if there's a here and there's another one here, they're not in the same place. Well, actually, they may be in different places and the same place at the same time. It gets very complicated. So you start off from the simple and it becomes more complicated. And this is true, I believe, of our intellectual life as well. This year, we are remembering, marking, noting, some people celebrating 500 years since Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. And what he did was challenge the whole way of understanding life that was encompassed in Christendom. And that way was largely to say that authority for the understanding of things lay with the church. And that if you came across some ideas and you started to publish them that contradicted what the authority of the church said, well, they were just wrong. And it was dangerous, and you get into trouble. Big trouble. You probably get burnt at the stake. And he started to say, well, I don't believe that, because I don't actually believe that the authority of an institution like that can tell us the truth about what's happening. He then decided it was about the Bible. And for many hundreds of years, people operated on that kind of basis. And then people began to say, well, no, it's not that. We got to apply our capacity as rational human beings. Apply our rationality, our human rationality, our logical capacities to think and investigate and experiment and find out what is the truth of the way life is constructed. This was enormously successful. Science developed, medicine, technology based on the science developed, communications, travel, transport, extraordinary developments. And when you come to the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, people were hugely optimistic that just a few more generations of education in rationality and science was going to resolve our problems. Not only would we be discover things and be able to do more things, but we would be a peaceful, stable, prosperous world, because people would act in their own best interests and in the best interests of society as a whole. And clearly war and conflict is not in the best interests of individual people or societies. It's a very destructive thing. And then came the First World War. And all that science and technology was used to destroy life, to prosecute war, to produce destruction of people and places at an unprecedented rate. And people said, oh, wait a minute. This isn't working. Human rationality on its own does not seem to be able to contain human aggression. Maybe it was the political context and structures. Maybe it was the imperial structures that did not give people an opportunity, all people, to participate in democracy, where everybody could contribute in a rational, thoughtful, reasonable way, where we could have elections where people could make decisions in their own best interest. And so, in the place that the war had apparently developed from, in Germany, a new constitution was developed. It was called the Weimar Constitution, which was, if you look back on it, an extraordinarily democratic constitution. In addition to that, the nation states came together in a League of Nations. And as I referred to, they began to try to get intellectuals of all kinds to contribute, to make sure that they never went back, that we never went back, that nobody ever went back to the awful application of human understanding to human destruction. And the most educated country, and the country with the most clearly democratic constitution in the world at the time, was Germany. And you know what happened in Germany in the 1930s. Human rationality and inclusive democracy on their own did not stop a second global conflict. A global conflict that was arguably even worse than the first one. And by the end of that conflict, we had also used our human rationality and capacity for science and technology to get to a point where we could not only destroy millions of people, but we could destroy the planet that we live on, to make it completely uninhabitable for generations, to destroy all life on this planet. That's what we'd achieved. And so people said, wait, this rationality and inclusive democracy are not enough. We've got to set down a rules-based way of operating that says to people what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. For individual people, we will identify what are individual human rights. What are the rights that you have by dint of being a human being? Wherever you're born in the world, whatever political system you live under, you will have rights. Rights of life, of liberty, of the capacity to relate to others, to believe what you believe, to follow your own lights. And also, to have a reasonable possibility for education and a standard of living and a house to live in, and so on. And at a global level, we will create new institutions, a United Nations, which will take us beyond the League of Nations. Financial instruments, financial institutions in the Bretton Woods institutions, which will try to ensure that the vulnerability to economic breakdown is not going to cause us trouble again. And at a regional level, we'll come together, first of all in Europe, but then in other regions, in a supranational collaboration, which will ensure that nationalism and religious views and extreme political positions do not again return us to violence and war. So in addition to human rationality, we add human rights. But you know, it's not been enough. That's clear. This linear progression that says we need to add in a bit more, we need to add in a bit more. And if we did this as well as that and the other thing, we would make sure that this didn't happen. I don't think any of us can look around the world at the moment and think that simply having inclusive democracy or rationality in education or the applications of science and technology We're trying to insist on human rights, even going beyond the nation state to say we now, as an international global community, have a responsibility to protect others whenever nation states start to abuse their own people. But who's going to decide? Who's going to make these decisions? Who's going to make the intervention? Who is going to be the global policeman and judge and jury and prison officer? Who's going to do it? The states, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. They can't even agree a motion on some of the areas where the greatest difficulty is held. And so this has led me to a view over quite a long number of years that this linear way of understanding is not going to resolve our problems. See, I used to experience it when a patient would be brought along to me. Maybe a young lady with an eating disorder, or somebody with an alcohol problem. And I would meet them, and I would listen to them, and I would say, you know, I think part of the problem this person has is not just about them, it's about the relationships in their family. I don't think I can understand or intervene or do anything to resolve this problem if this young 15-year-old woman does not bring her parents along, or perhaps her siblings as well. And we sit down with the whole family and we try to understand what is going on in this family system. Then I began to start working with people with alcohol and drug addiction problems, and I began to discover that when you started to work with the person who was the identified patient, and they started to get better, the family started to break down. How strange. What we had done was intervene in the system, not just with the individual person, not just adding this and this and this, but you actually made a change to the whole system. I mentioned football earlier on. Anybody that knows anything about managing a football team knows that when you bring in a new player, it changes the whole dynamic of the team. It's not just a question of saying, oh, thank goodness we've now got a striker, or thank goodness we've now got a goalie. It changes the relationships within the team. And indeed, it's not just the people on the pitch. We also know that the others who are outside but engaged and involved, they too can change the whole way the team functions. And so we begin to understand that we're not just individuals, and this linear notion of resolving problems doesn't work because we operate in complex systems. The difficulty about that is that when you make an intervention, it doesn't immediately bring you from A to B. It changes what's going on in the system in a way that may not be wholly predictable. And as we've begun to try to look at those things more, what is developed is not just systems theory, but what we now call complexity theory, where we understand that it's all more complicated than that. Your brother would say you didn't need a PhD to find out life was complicated. But actually, in a way, we have, because we've tried as scientists to break down, simplify and understand, which is absolutely useful and appropriate, but forgot that when we separated out the pieces, one of the things we lost was the significance of the connectedness. Well, if it's very complicated, what on earth are we going to say about it? Does that mean we have to leave it to somebody else because it's all too difficult? Well, it seems to me that there is some truth in that, and yet at the same time, all of us exist in, and only can exist in, a degree of complexity, which we call relationships. Relationships are a very complicated business. None of us are experts in it. All of us operate by trial and error, often more error than trial. But we do have a sense of what relationships are like. We know very well that if I'm in relationship with this person and I start to have a relationship with this person, it affects the relationship with this person, often catastrophically. And we sort of know that. We try to ignore it sometimes, but we do actually know it. And it seems to me that to human rationality, We need to add human rights. I don't say at all that we dismiss human rationality. It's very important. I certainly don't say we dismiss human rights. They are important, disturbing principles about how we should engage with other people. But I think we need to add human relationships to it. Not just rationality and rights, but relationships. And not just relationships as individuals. That was what Freud was really very good at. And he began to understand a little bit also about large group psychology, but we've taken that a little bit further because we know that the way we relate to each other as large groups is not just how we relate to each other as a bunch of individuals. And we're only beginning to understand the significance of it. But what it means is that when communities break down into violence and conflict that doesn't easily resolve itself, and some of them do resolve themselves quite easily, because as you make that intervention of conflict in the system jigs around over a little while and settles itself down. This can be really frustrating, by the way. You know, if you're an activist, for example, and you see a society functioning in a way that you don't like, and so you embark on a campaign to try to change it, and maybe you get elected, or maybe you get somebody else elected, maybe you can get a new president elected, and they discover it's very difficult to make a difference. Because the system sort of absorbs that change and settles itself down again. It takes a very major shift to actually change the system. And I've visited with a number of presidents in various parts of the world, and not least in Latin America, where they've got themselves elected, determined that they're going to change things, and I find it's much more difficult. It's not a matter just of a few new laws or a few new people. It's actually a cultural change. It's a change in the whole way of being of that community. A way of being that in some ways has gone on for generations. So changing it's not at all easy. We know how difficult it is for each of us to change our individual habits. So how much more difficult is it for a whole community to change its habits, not of a lifetime, but of generations. So these systemic changes are not easy to bring about. But if we don't understand them, we'll just end up being very frustrated by them. And if we begin to understand that the problems we have are problems of historic, disturbed relationships between large groups of people, then we may be able to analyse it in a different way. That was the fundamental learning of the Irish peace process. We didn't look and say, what's the outlook we want to find? What's the political system we want to have? How are we going to make people be better off? We'd done all of that and it didn't work. Like the other linear thinking. Or the other, let's try everything possible. We started by saying, what are the disturbed historic relationships? Let's get together the people who represent those relationships and get them to engage with each other about their relationships. And let's construct a different way of engaging with each other that addresses the problems and the relationships. And it gave us an opportunity to begin to make that sort of systemic change. Now, even now, we find new challenges and difficulties. One of them is that you can change all the institutions and constitutions of human rights and policing and administration of justice and social economic development, and people's attitudes are still the same. And people's attitudes don't change by getting them to read something, or trying to teach them something, or get them to a workshop. People's attitudes often change by experiences that move them. And some of the things that move people are sport, and art, and music, and drama, and poetry, and all of these kinds of things that are really difficult to measure and contain, and yet we know they make enormous differences. And so that's where we are at the moment. Another little step in trying to understand the complexity of our engagements with each other, and the complexity of resolving conflict. And it is so complicated that we all need each other with our different experiences in our different communities, in different parts of this world, if we're going to be able to take that next step forward. But let me finish with one remark. Because people very often get a bit down about how difficult it is to experience conflict and to resolve it. When we live in fairly peaceful, stable parts of the world, we don't make massive changes in the way we understand things. Our understandings evolve a little bit here and a little bit there. We add a little bit to this and a little bit to that, but there's not the drive for a paradigm shift, for a whole new way of understanding things, unless we find it breaking down. In politics, for example, it's very difficult to change the constitution of a country if everything's going okay. You may say it's not ideal, but it's going okay. How do you change the electoral system of a country if the government that got elected on that system benefits from it? Why on earth would they change it? You only change it when it breaks down. You only understand these things in a new way when trouble arises. That's what provokes you to make a big difference. You know you have to. And so although our experience in going through conflict is a difficult, complicated, extremely painful one, the other side of it is that it gives us an opportunity to understand new things about the way communities function and develop new understandings that take us forward. And that's one of the exciting possibilities that we have if we find a way through our conflicts and a way of understanding how we got there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those extraordinary talks. And now you're open to discussions or questions. Do you have any questions? There's no questions.
Hi everybody. I know that you have a lot of experience with different peace processes worldwide, but here analyzing Colombia's context, how to make it right when there's a double conflict here in Colombia with drug trafficking. That's the main cause of conflict here in Colombia, and there's an effort to solve this problem, but it connects with peace crisis. And for example, financing this peace process will mix around those two different problems. How to make it right? How not to mix those different problems that can have like damage to communities, like for example, do no harm is very important with this dealing process, and paying people to not continue producing cocaine makes people that has maintained illegal economy to try to do it, because if we are helping people that have been in the illicit problem of cocaine, why me that I have maintained in a legal process, I'm not being helped? I don't have solution, I don't have health and education system. So here is a big problem with cocaine, that it's a problem that continues, that is been maintaining because worldwide it's a demand of drugs. So how to solve this problem that will continue, that is very difficult to eradicate, and that is like the main cause of conflict here in Colombia?
Well, it's very tempting to say it's the main cause of the conflict. But that's back to linear thinking again. And one of the things that we know is that absolutely the drug industry creates massive problems. But then you have to also ask, why do people do that? Somebody comes along to me with an alcohol problem, and I say, you've got a real problem with drinking. It's causing all sorts of difficulties in your life and relationships. That's the cause of your problems. Then I've misunderstood what's going on, because it doesn't tell me why they're drinking too much. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why they're drinking too much. And there's a whole bunch of reasons. It's not just the fact that coca is an expensive commodity that you can get a lot of money for. That's one component of it. But there are lots of other components in the history and background of Colombia. For example, the problems of Colombia did not start with cocaine. They started a long time before that. Certainly a long time before it became a global commodity. And we need to look at those kinds of things. And then we need to also look at practicalities. I mean, I remember the last time I was here last year, I was really struck coming down from being up country by thinking to myself, you know, if I was a farmer and I had a load of oranges, it's really easy to grow them up here. Or potatoes, or flowers, or whatever, really easy, but it's almost impossible to get them to market, because the roads are terrible, absolutely dreadful. But if somebody gave me a bag of coca and said, can you make it to town? Well, it would be easy. So one of the very practical things is, it's going to be very difficult to persuade farmers that they can have a livelihood if the tertiary roads in Colombia are so terrible that they can't get anything to market, and yet the roads are terrible. It's not to say that if you build good roads, you're going to solve the drug problem, or you're going to solve the conflict problem, or whatever, because it's a complex web of issues. But many of these issues need addressed, and some of them can have a helpful impact, and even a knock-on impact, because, for example, if you build decent roads, not only can the farmers get their goods out, but the police can get in, and governance arrangements can be improved. That's why the Romans built roads. They didn't build them for trade purposes, they built them to get soldiers from place to place quickly so they could deal with their enemies. It's not a new idea, and you'll not be able to build straight roads in Colombia for sure, and I know that's true. But there are lots of components to this, and so when you find yourself saying, the cause of our problems is this, and it's not about relationships, and it's not about how we are emotionally, stop yourself and say, a very important cause of our problems is this, and what are the other things that we need to consider at the same time? Thank you very much.
Just to continue there, with the issue of the complexity that Dr. Dice mentioned, I never come across any conflict that was the result of one single cause. I mean, there is nothing like that. I mean, I think all conflicts that I come across, there are so many reasons, and they change in time. They are dynamic. You know, whatever the causes may be 40 years ago, maybe are quite different today. So there, I think we need to be very careful. If we, for example, in Colombia, are thinking about peace building on the issue of cocoa and cocoa production, and as you pointed out, we might start to do more harm than good, as Mary Anderson advocates. So the issue of dividers and connectors. If we start the journey with the wrong roadmap to plan, peace processes are not natural processes. They actually have huge interventions power. They change the society, as the advice was telling us earlier. So you can actually create more problems because of the peace process. And many societies across the world went through a number of peace processes. And each time, actually, the conflict dynamics went back to worse. So we really need to be careful to understand the conflict. So, and on the issue of the cocoa and the high commodity production, I find that really ironic because the international community, since the end of the Cold War, goes around the world and implements peace with the idea of liberal peace, based on two principles: market economy and democratization. And that democratization is in fact the most undemocratic way of thinking about democracy. It's a top-down democracy. Us, democratic nations, will come and sort you out. We'll make you democratized, like in Afghanistan and other places. We'll put the democracy on a plane, send it to you, and you'll be democratic after organizing an election. And on the issue of market economy, what we are dictating is that, well, market economy is good, and we need to have free tariffs and system. And within that, isn't it reasonable and logical that local farmers produce cocoa instead of other commodities? Or Afghan farmers, why shouldn't they produce poppy seeds instead of wheat? It's like 100 times more valuable. So So on the one hand, we advocate the principles of market economy, choice and all that, but then we say, well actually, no, we don't want you to prove business. So I think those approaches are so harmful to the way we implement peace and peace-building programs in different places across the world.
Yes, actually just to that, it's quite interesting because we have come from different methodological traditions here. And one of the things I found when I started to get interested in statistics was that it's a confluence of many different factors that come together. And in physics, it's often sort of like, it's quite a simple thing that, power times acceleration equals force. But in peace building and politics, there are probably 10 different factors, and it's a case of the perfect storm, if you like. So I think it's interesting sort of, in some ways that we all agree on that, even if we come from different traditions. I think what you also said, I heard you saying, why is it fair that there's sort of an amnesty for those who were selling drugs before, but I've been on the straight and narrow all the time, and it doesn't seem fair. And I used to be a lawyer, and I used to think you just have to follow the rules. And I think in a way that's like very sort of linear thinking. Yes, of course it should be like that. Of course you should have the rule of law. But I think sometimes when it comes to peace and peace building, there is also a time when you sort of need to let bygones be bygones, and you need to sort of say, yes, that was bad. But I think it's often, if you look backwards, and most of I was involved in as an expert and an envoy in Sudan before they had their referendum on independence there. So I worked for the US State Department at the time, and the basic principles we had as mediators, not that we were very good because this hasn't been solved properly, I'm sorry to say, but the basic principle we had was that you can talk about anything except the past. And after a couple of days, there was total silence, because it used to be with all the negotiations, it was like, yeah, but you used to kill us in that battle. And then they would say, yes, we already did that because you killed us in that battle. And you were so nasty. Yes, but that's only because you were nastier still, further back in time. And I think sometimes if we we can't ignore history, but if we sometimes get focused on how bad things were and what the other side has done in the past, then I think that's undermining peace. But so I think that's the other aspect of it. Yes, there are many factors, but also if we get too hung up about the past, we tend never to get to the future.
I have two questions. The first one is, when we're talking about that we have to have in account many things, and it's not only one cause of the war, but the other point is to try to do everything at the same time, and that you say that was it is what we are trying to do now, and it's exactly what actually is happening. How to have in account different things, but not fall in the problems to try to do all the things at the same time, because here we have drug problems, but also about land, but also about connections, but also about democracy. But there are so many things, and actually our agreement is about many points, and the new agreement with the ALN is talking about different points also, and there are also other points that are not written in either of those, but are also problems of the society, and if there is no solution of that, will not be peace, like a real peace in the country. So how to try to solve different causes of the war, but not to fall in the problem to try to do everything at the same time. And the second question is, when you were talking about the importance of the feelings and the relationships, here in Colombia, and with the process of elections between say yes or no to the agreement, we had a campaign about feelings. And actually, the opposite point of the agreements used it very well, those feelings, to attach people and to make them feel angry and feel bad, and to say no to the peace process. So It's very easy here if we still use our feelings to continue separating people, maybe the 60% of the people who did not even vote, to say, okay, you 60 that you don't care, now say yes or no, but try, like keeping separating people and how to do not fall in that issue.
I'm very reminded, they just handed me the microphone and said, you start. And I remember many years ago I was at a meeting of the Canadian Liberals when Jean Chrétien was the Prime Minister. And most Prime Ministers, when they're at their party conference, they stand up on their own and they're the focus of attention. He was much cleverer than that. What he did was he got all his ministers to stand behind him. And anybody could ask him any question they liked. And if it was a nice question, he answered it. And if it was a nasty question, he handed it to one of his ministers and said, you answer it. And their place in the cabinet depended upon whether they could give a good answer. So I feel I've kind of been passed the buck in Jean Chrétien's style, but I asked for it, I guess. One of the problems about the wheelbarrow approach to peacemaking, that is to say, you gather up everything you can and put it in the wheelbarrow, is that that degree of complexity makes it almost impossible for people to understand what's happening and be supportive of it. I give you an example. The agreement that was reached between FARC and the government goes to dozens and dozens and dozens of papers and chapters, pages and chapters. It's completely impossible for members of the public to read that agreement and have any kind of idea what is the truth or not of it. We were absolutely not perfect, but the agreement that we reached in Northern Ireland was a slim enough document that it was possible to produce that and send it to every single household in Northern Ireland. Everybody got a free copy of the whole agreement. They could read it, they could argue about it, they could talk about it over the lunch table, they could listen to programs about it, and it was relatively straightforward to know if somebody said that's in the agreement, you could look up your copy and say, well, that's not what it says at all. It's almost impossible to do that in respect of the agreement that you have here because there is so much in it and it is so complicated. I'll bet you that 95% of the journalists haven't even read the whole agreement. And in the process of reaching the agreement, one of the other mistakes was to not discuss much of what was happening in the talks outside. They were being held at a distance, and much of what was going on was being speculated about in the press, but the government didn't feel able to come out and say, no, that's not what we're saying at all. That's not what we're doing. One of the ways that we operated was that the talks took place mostly in Northern Ireland, that every evening when the participants in the talks went out, the press were there waiting for them and they would make comment. True or false, they would make comment. They'd go home, they'd talk to their colleagues, they'd argue about it, they'd try to say what they were trying to do, and they would come in the next morning and continue on with the process. It wasn't separated off. People knew something of what was going on. So there are approaches like this that I think are important and that we understand because whatever the logicality of it, we understand that human beings function in certain kinds of ways. If you make things too complicated and people don't understand what's going on, they will immediately assume the worst. It's just the way we are. We don't tend to assume the best. We assume the worst, particularly if you're coming out of a situation of conflict with horrible memories of what has happened. And so lots of claims were made during the referendum campaign, which were manifestly untrue, but it was very difficult for anybody to become aware of whether they were true or not. Now, I could speak about lots of other aspects, but hopefully that gives some kind of sense of the kind of approach that I think is important, and some of the mistakes that I think have been made, and are quite difficult to repair.
Thank you. I really like your question because in a way you sort of turned the table around and said, well, okay guys, you are talking about complexity of causes, but then the response should be complex too, so let's surround with that. That's really good. And I'll be devil's advocate here, and I'll look at some of the issues you raised in a different way. Not necessarily right or wrong, but I just want to open the debate here a little bit more. And there, when you look at the sort of complexity of responses, and I must say, the peace deal here in Colombia is really a beacon of hope for many societies across the world, what Colombia has achieved. And trust me, many societies, conflict-affected societies, watch Colombian experience very closely, whether or not it's going to be successful. And so in that way, I think we are in a very critical place. And as the citizens of Colombia, you are the implementers of that beacon of hope in a way. So I think that's really important. And there, for example, the whole process, what needs to be done, your question. There are lots of things, but let me just say three main things. One of the key issues in any process is the legitimacy of that peace, and those who say that they are building peace. The legitimacy needs to be gained through experience, and in many places this is not the case in Colombia, but in other places the international community militarily intervene and try to gain that legitimacy through coercion, which is very problematic. But here, the referendum result, and I must say, I can say that I was really shocked, I was really upset that the referendum result was negative. I thought, this is impossible, this was the beacon of hope, what's going on? But when you think about it, retrospectively, probably it was the good thing as an outcome, because in a way, the public here said, well, hold on a second, I have something to say about this. And I'm not quite sure that I like this deal that much. I want something different. So revising it, I think, has given more legitimacy to the peace process. And the people of Colombia had their say on it too. So I think in that way, I'm more positive about that outcome and what followed. And it could have been disastrous, obviously. It could have just fallen apart completely, but it didn't. And in a way, I think it was quite an interesting experience. The second point of what needs to be done is that political will in any peace process. Now, conflict resolution and peace building in terms of conflict transformation. And your deal is a very interesting one because it addresses those issues separately. Now, what's going to be done in peace building in the name of conflict transformation will be the litmus test, whether or not it's going to work or not. And we are talking about next 5, 10, 15 years. It's a very long period for politics, isn't it? So in terms of having that commitment, that long to pursue the objectives of peace, you will see. And I think that is probably the most critical aspect of that. Whether or not the next president will have similar agenda, or whether or not the dynamics of armed conflict or some sort of struggle might seem to be more attractive to those parties. These are the critical issues. And the last and final point I want to make is that in that response, for me, the most critical aspect is the engagement in peace process, the implementation of peace building in a multi-layer aspect, in a multi-layer way. So, this is about peace building at school, in the family, in the workplace, and we really need to bring all those aspects down to ground, to the ordinary people. And it should really start to make sense for them, because they were the ones who suffered most by the conflict. And they should be the main agents of that process. And that's what the conflict transformation is all about. Empowering people to be the main agent of their own peace building. And whether or not Colombia will be able to do that, will be the kind of decisive factor, one of the decisive factors of whether that beacon of hope will be the reality over the next 5 to 10 years.
I suppose coming back to the point that Lord Alderdice made first about it being an open process. I remember when the negotiations were going on, and you guys were locked up in Stormont negotiating. And in Britain we have a thing called Radio 5 Live. They normally have sports programs, so if the cricket or the football is on, you listen to Radio 5 Live. And there was live transmissions from the negotiations, peace negotiations, as if it was a cycling race. And I remember I was looking after my little son at that time. I was out in the
it's quite a British kind of thing, I suppose, when they're organised. So I think that also made, this was even in the mainland, made it an inclusive process that you could have a view on, because it was reported in that particular way. I think if you then go back and say, well, Colombia's got all these problems, and yes, Colombia has all those problems, and there was a deal that was rejected, but then in many other places that are now considered to be quite stable democracies, like the Netherlands or Finland or Switzerland, there are probably very few countries that are seen as stable, so they're actually not enormously stable all the time. But what was interesting was when the Swiss had their first power-sharing constitutions. The Swiss used to be very divided over religious lines, over economic issues, and it wasn't at all a peaceful place. Their first attempt at a power-sharing constitution was rejected, and they had to go back and get more legitimacy. And the way they gave it more legitimacy was quite a wonderful way. There's an Argentinian professor who is based in Switzerland who writes about this, and she said, of course, you never get turkeys to vote for Christmas. That's a saying we have in Britain. But sometimes if you can convince the turkeys that another little animal has led to this water, they might conceivably vote for that. So sometimes it's also just sort of finding ways in which you can get turkeys